There are a total of 10 new shields in this Elden Ring DLC, 2 of which are actually under the new weapon type thrusting shields, and we are going to be ranking all of them from worst to best based on how useful they are and how well they perform in PvE. It has been about 2 weeks since I've done my last DLC ranking video. I was kind of done with all of them and I wasn't really planning to rank the shields, but after playing with them a bunch more, I think all of these are actually worth talking about, so that's what we're going to be doing today. Starting off at number 10, the Golden Lion Shield. This is a medium shield that does get 100% physical guarded damage negation, does get some okay elemental guarded damage negation too, but unfortunately it only does get 55 guard boost at max level, which compared to a lot of other medium shields, they get well over 60. Something like the MESSMER's Soldier Shield gets very similar weight, requirements, and guarded damage negation, but that gets 66 guard boost instead, which is much higher. But the Golden Lion Shield does get a unique skill in Roaring Bash, which is just a reskinned version of Shield Bash, and that is like a short range attack that can stagger some enemies. Doesn't do like the greatest amount of damage nor the greatest amount of stance damage, but it can be good at interrupting those smaller enemies that are in the middle of like an attack combo, because it is going to stagger nicely and it's going to give you some blocking frames. But Roaring Bash in particular actually does do this in an AoE attack, which is going to make it hit at a further distance, so you can be a bit further away and still benefit, and it is going to be good at hitting those multiple enemies at once. But it's not going to be that much better than like regular Shield Bash, because Shield Bash with certain types of shields can actually get more damage. It is going to be cheaper as well, and it has the same stance damage too. So the only use of Roaring Bash would be to like stagger those enemies that are all surrounding you, which is just extremely niche. If I did want to be able to like stagger or stun lock those smaller enemies with a shield, I'd much rather have Shield Crash instead. This skill could do some decent damage, send enemies flying, and can stun lock a lot better. And you could put that on like another medium shield like the Brass Shield, and not only are you going to have the better skill, but you're also going to have a lot better blocking as well. If this was a great shield instead, I probably would have valued it a lot more, because it probably would have done a lot more damage, and you could have made like the AoE a bit larger too. But as it stands right now, there's not really much of a reason to use it. Number 9, Shield of Night. Now this is actually a small shield that does perform terribly as is like a regular shield, like trying to block with it is not going to be very optimal. It gets some of the worst guard boost out of all the shields in the game, and this gets like the worst physical guarded damage negation too at 55% when maxed out. The only good part about its blocking is going to be its 70% that it gets with magic guarded damage negation. But the unique thing about this shield is going to be its skill Revenge of the Night, which for 5 FP does shoot out a very quick projectile attack that does not do good damage at all, but it is very cheap, so you could just use it to clean up some kills. And with how fast the projectile is, enemies are probably not going to be dodging it. But the whole gimmick of this shield is using it as a guard counter, because when you block with it, you actually can do a guard counter with the skill. So clicking the skill button will actually make it shoot out this very high damaging projectile instead, which this projectile does roughly 4 times as much damage. Does do about 10 stance damage. It is also pure magic damage as well, and it does scale with the dexterity stat. But unfortunately, the damage is still not there. It doesn't work with things like the Curve Sword Talisman nor the Deflect tier, which is like super annoying. And the fact that this shield only gets a D scaling in dexterity doesn't help it either. If it had like a B or an A scaling in dexterity, the damage could be a lot higher. And it's to the point that if you are blocking with this thing, you might as well just guard counter with your regular weapon, because it's going to do way higher damage, going to do way more stance damage, and that's not going to consume FP. But obviously the major benefit of this is to guard counter those projectile attacks. If an enemy shoots a projectile at you, you could just block it and just return it back at them. But with how bad this thing is actually at blocking, and with how little damage it actually does end up doing as well, it's still not really worth using. But it definitely does need to get buffed. It needs to be able to work with the Deflect tier and the Curve Sword Talisman. It needs to get a better dexterity scaling, because in its current state, it leaves a lot to be desired. Number 8, the Wolf Crest Shield, which is just a pretty solid medium shield overall. Does get 100% physical guarded damage negation, does get 66 guard boost, which is some of the highest for the medium shields. Overall, it's not going to be as good as things like the MESSMER shield or the Brass Shield. Those ones are going to be higher guard boost and just get better guarded damage negation across the board, except for when it comes to the magic stat, which is going to be this thing's major benefit. It does get 63 magic guarded damage negation, and when magic infused, it does get 78% damage negation. So when fighting those magic types of bosses, it's going to be pretty useful. Now, if you did only really care to like block those magic types of projectiles, there are going to be better things out there, like the CARIAN Knight Shield and the Silver Mirror Shield as well. These things get 89% magic guarded damage negation. However, those things do have intelligence requirements, and they do get a bit less guard boost as well. But also there is the existence of Scholar's Shield, which for only 12 intelligence, you can give yourself 70% more magic guarded damage negation, and you can just throw that onto a Brass Shield and this is going to perform really well. So it is a pretty niche shield overall, but I wouldn't really bother wasting my smithing stones to upgrade it. Number 7, the Serpent Crest Shield. This is another medium shield that does perform very well, gets the 100% physical guarded damage negation, and actually does get 68 guard boost, which is the second highest out of all the medium shields. It's just behind the Brass Shield, which does get 69. Now, the Brass Shield is still going to be better across the board in terms of elemental damage negation, except for the fire stat. The Serpent's Crest Shield does get 63%, and if you do have it Flame Art infused, it is going to give you 78% fire guarded damage negation. But do keep in mind, if you do have an elemental infusion, it is going to lower the guard boost by a whole bunch. So if you are going to go into an area that does have predominantly fire damage as the main source, this is the best medium shield to use in the game. But in almost every other instance, I'd probably rather just have the Brass Shield, but this thing actually does have a lower strength requirement, so it's not going to be useless. Number 6, the Black Steel Great Shield. Now this is an infusible Great Shield that does perform somewhat well across the board, gets the 100% physical block, does get 77 guard boost, which for its 19.5 weight unit, there are going to be better shields out there for the same weights that do just have higher guard boost, but the major benefit of this shield is going to be its Holy Guarded Damage negation, which the Holy negation is at 84%, which is amazing, and when you have it Sacred infused, it's actually 100%. So you can literally block 100% of Holy damage with this shield with a Sacred infusion, which obviously sounds great for all those bosses that do Holy damage. Now once again, if you do have an Elemental infusion, you are going to have a lot less guard boost, and your physical damage negation is lowered as well to 95%. And a lot of bosses are still going to have physical damage as an option as well. So in most cases, when you are blocking, you're still going to be taking some chip damage. So it's not like you're going to have good synergy with like the Ritual Sword Talisman. And if that's the case, I'd probably just still rather have the Erdtree Crest Great Shield. This is another Great Shield that also does get very good Holy Guarded Damage negation. But with a Sacred Infusion, it's 99% Holy Guarded Damage negation. It is going to be lighter. It actually does get better blocking with all the other elements. So if you do fight a boss that actually does multiple types alongside Holy damage, or if you're going through like a Legacy dungeon that actually gets multiple damage types as well, this one is going to be more versatile. And it actually does get higher guard boost too. So I would just sacrifice the 1% Holy Guarded Damage negation that you would get, just to have something better across the board. But the Black Steel Great Shield is still a perfectly fine option. Number 5, the MESSMER Soldier Shield. Now the existence of this shield might be purely because of fashion, because one, it actually is a pure black shield. You can't go wrong with pure black. And it actually is the only circle medium shield in the game with 100% physical guarded damage negation, which is obviously amazing. If a shield does not get 100% physical guarded damage negation, 90% of the time it's just useless. But it is just a very solid overall shield as well. It gets pretty decent elemental guarded damage negation, and it gets 66 guard boost, which is not going to be better than the Brass Shield, because the Brass Shield does get 69 guard boost, and actually does get higher elemental guarded damage negation, except for lightning. But there might be some builds to where you want to use the MESSMER Soldier Shield over the Brass Shield, because it actually is a couple of units lighter, and it only has a 10 strength requirement. The Brass Shield requires 16 strength. So for those pure dexterity types of builds, or just any build that's not going to require much strength, this one is going to be the more optimal option for you. But if you do have at least 16 strength, then the Brass Shield is going to be the better option. Number 4, the Dueling Shield, which is one of the 2 thrusting shields, which both are amazing. This weapon category is really powerful. Now both shields are very similar, same stance damage values, same Ash of War options, but the major differences being is that the Dueling Shield can actually get higher damage in most infusions except for magic, because the CARIAN shield actually does get split magic damage, which in most instances is going to result in just less overall damage. The Dueling Shield is actually a little bit lighter, and it does have lower requirements as well, so it is going to be a lot easier to build around, and it is going to help maximize your damage with a lot of different types of infusions. But when building into a thrusting shield, the optimal way is just keeping it physical infused, because you want to benefit of just better guarded damage negation and higher guard boost, because the major selling point of the thrusting shield is being able to block and attack at the exact same time, because all of your attacks do get blocking frames, of which is going to make you take less damage and not get staggered as well. And going with elemental infusions is going to make the shield portion of the weapon a lot worse. And with how valuable that is, I just recommend using the CARIAN thrusting shield instead, because this weapon does get much higher guard boost and much higher physical guarded damage negation. The Dueling Shield is going to be a lot better at blocking lightning and holy damage, so there might be some uses there. And it also doesn't have that 15 intelligence requirement as the CARIAN thrusting shield does have. But if I am speccing into one of these options, I would much rather just go with the CARIAN thrusting shield. Number 3, the VERDIGRIS Great Shield. Now this is a Great Shield that does actually offer the highest guard boost in the entire game at 90, which is actually higher than the Fingerprint Shield, which is at 86. It is also going to be a little bit lighter as well. So when fighting those enemies that do pure physical damage, this is just the best shield to have in the entire game. There are so many bosses that can just be trivialized by just having this shield or just shield poking with it, but I still would just rather have the fingerprint shield instead because it is just better overall, mainly because of its elemental guided damage negation. It's just higher across the board. Every single element just gets better blocking with this one, and it actually can be infused, meaning that you can pair it alongside multiple infusions like bleed or holy, whatever you wanted to do. Put on something like shield crash and you can get a very solid damaging option out of your shield, whereas for the Verdigris Great Shield, unfortunately you can't really do that. It can still be buffed with shield grease and scholar shield, but unfortunately you can't infuse it and it gets stuck with its skill Moore's charge, which is identical to shield crash. It's the exact same animation, but the difference is that it does have a little bit of an AoE effect at the end of it, so it can hit multiple enemies potentially, but it just also does no damage, which I don't know why it just doesn't do any damage, because if you're using shield crash, that skill is actually going to do respectable damage, work with the multi-hit talismans, and with status effects it can proc them quickly too. So I don't really understand the purpose of this skill, especially because it's more expensive. It does actually do a little bit more stance damage, so although it is the best physical guarded damage negation shield in the entire game with the best guard boost, I probably still would just rather use the fingerprint shield instead. Number 2, the SMITHSCRIPT shield, which is a unique small shield in this game, and for blocking it is not useful at all. Gets terrible guard boost, gets terrible guarded damage negation. It's just not really that viable to try and block with it, but its entire purpose is going to be its unique skill Discus Hurl, which for only 3 FP shoots out this very decent damaging attack. I literally did a challenge run today on streaming, beating the entire game and the DLC only using this one attack, and honestly it wasn't really much of a challenge run because 3 FP is basically nothing. You're just like never going to run out of FP with this thing, and you're going to keep spamming an attack that can go very far, do some decent damage, and have like a little bit of a delayed effect. So when fighting those enemies that like to move, input, read, and dodge around like NPCs, they're just going to get hit and roll caught every single time. And best of all yet, the stamina cost is also very low. So you can just spam this thing like 20 times over, do some very good damage, not really lose much FP, and just only benefit. It does scale best of strength. So if you do have a strength type of build and you're lacking a projectile option, you can just throw this in your offhand, and any single time that an enemy gets further away from you, you can just spam the skill. It's not going to cost much. It's going to do decent damage. It's going to hit them more times than not because the tracking is actually insane. I threw this shield like thousands of times, and the amount of times that I missed, I could probably count on my hand. But as I always mention, projectile attacks just cheese the entire game because it means that you don't really have to engage with an enemy. You can just sit further back and just keep picking them off with these projectiles. It's also a way to stop stance damage from regenning as well. There are so many benefits to having projectiles, and this one is going to be one of the better ones in the game. Number 1, the CARIAN thrusting shield. Now, as I mentioned with the dueling shield, this whole weapon type is just cracked. They're probably one of the best R1 spamming weapons in the entire game, and probably one of the better guard countering weapons too. Every single light attack does come out very fast and do 12 stance damage, which for these speeds, that's kind of just ridiculous, and you're getting blocking frames as well. So throughout certain parts of the animation that you get these blocking frames, if you get hit there, you're not going to be taking much damage at all, and best of all yet, you're not going to get staggered. There is also a blocking attack that is just basically guaranteed blocking frames, and even these light attacks also do 12 stance damage, and also do some pretty decent damage as well. Like, these things don't get low AR. They're actually pretty good, and they're doing piercing damage, which, as I always mention, the best damage type in the entire game. A lot of enemies are weaker to it, and throughout an attack animation, enemies are just going to take bonus damage, which obviously has a great synergy with something like this. And you can pair this alongside the spear talisman, and you're just doing so much more damage. Now, unfortunately, the heavy attacks are just shit. I don't care to use these at all. They're way too long, and they don't do good damage, and their stance damage is like worse than a medium shield. Even straight swords get more stance damage with a charged heavy attack. But another thing that's really good about them is their guard counters. It does get 37 stance damage on a guard counter. It's going to be piercing damage as well, which in most cases that you're using a guard counter is probably in the middle of an attack animation, of which you're going to be doing really good damage. But best of all yet, it actually does get blocking frames on the recovery animation, which typically if you're trying to guard counter in the middle of an attack animation, you might get staggered out of it, or you might get staggered directly afterwards. Whereas with the thrusting shield, that's not going to happen. You're just going to block it, not take much damage, not get staggered, and it's going to block it. So therefore, you can actually guard counter directly after that as well. And you can just keep cheesing bosses this way, pair it alongside the deflecting tier, and you have one of the best weapons in the entire game. Anyway, that's the video now done and complete. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video is probably going to be about some builds. I do want to make another best builds type of video. So if you do want to see that, definitely do subscribe. And also do follow me on Twitch because I am live there every single day doing a bunch of challenge runs. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.